Welcome to History Unwound. You are with Kate
and George. Today, we're going back to August of the year 79 and to the day a city stopped.
On the morning of the 24th of August, in the year 79, the city of Pompeii woke up to what looked like any other Tuesday. The fishmongers were hauling their ketchup from the harbor. Bakers were firing the ovens. Somebody was scratching a vulgar joke into the plaster on a tavern wall. Someone else was counting the change from a jug of wine.
It was the height of the Roman summer. The city had about 20,000 people living in it. A bathhouse was being renovated. Election notices for local magistrates were painted on the front of shops. Dogs were sleeping in doorways out of the sun.
And high above the city, on a perfectly ordinary green mountain, something that had been quietly building pressure for 1,500 years was about to give way.
By dawn the next morning, Pompeii would not exist.
Today on the show, the volcano that nobody in that city even recognized as a volcano, the eyewitness whose letters are the only reason we know what really happened, the bodies preserved in the shapes of their final seconds, and the strange accident of geology that gave us the closest thing to a time capsule the ancient world ever left behind.
Welcome to Pompeii, the day that stopped forever.
Before we get into it, quick favor, if you enjoy these deep dives, hit the follow button. It tells the algorithm more people want this kind of thing, and it means the next episode turns up in your feed automatically. We'd really appreciate it.
Alright, let's start with the mountain.
So we need to try to imagine Pompeii the way the Pompeians themselves saw it. This is a prosperous Roman resort town on the Bay of Naples. Beautiful Mediterranean climate. The soil is famously rich, volcanic soil, though they didn't know that's why it was rich. Grapes grow like weeds. Olive trees thrive. It's one of the most agriculturally productive corners of the empire.
And behind the city, rising about 6 miles inland, is this lovely green mountain, about 4,000 feet tall. Gentle slopes covered in vineyards and farmhouses. Wealthy Romans had country villas part way up it. It was what we would today call a desirable address.
What they called this mountain was Vesuvius. And here is the part that's almost impossible for a modern person to wrap their head around. The Romans did not know Vesuvius was a volcano.
They didn't even have a reliable category for volcano as a concept. They knew about Mount Etna in Sicily, which was constantly smoking and occasionally erupting, and they knew about Stromboli, which was famous for it. But they thought those were special cases. They didn't generalize.
The idea that a silent green mountain right next to a major city might be the same kind of thing as Etna, that mountains you could climb and farm and build on might, given enough time, blow themselves apart. That wasn't part of their worldview. There had been no eruption of Vesuvius in living memory. There had been no eruption of Vesuvius in recorded memory. The last major eruption before 79 happened sometime around 1800 BC, 18 centuries of silence.
For context, 18 centuries is the distance from us today back to the Roman Empire itself. It's deep time. Every Roman alive in 79 had grown up being told by their grandparents that the mountain was a mountain.
Now, Vesuvius had dropped a few hints. In the year 62, 17 years before the eruption, there was a serious earthquake in the region. It damaged buildings all over Pompeii. Here is a famous relief carving from a household shrine that shows the Temple of Jupiter in the Forum tilting to one side, which is what the household's patron saw during the quake. That earthquake was almost certainly magma moving deep under the mountain.
And for 16 years after that big quake, there were regular smaller tremors, dishes falling off shelves, fountains going dry and then coming back, livestock acting strangely. Pliny the Younger later wrote that tremors were, quote, not particularly alarming because they are frequent in Campania.
That's the line that does it for me. Not particularly alarming, because they're frequent. A city of 20,000 people is going to get buried alive in less than 24 hours, and the warnings have become so normal that nobody thinks about them anymore.
The Romans had a phrase, here is a version of it in Seneca, about how we treat familiar dangers. You acclimate, you stop seeing them. The mountain had been patient, and patience is its own kind of camouflage.
And it wasn't just that they didn't see the warning signs, it's that the cultural framework that would let them see the warning signs didn't exist yet. They had earthquake myths. They had stories of earth gods and sea gods and sky gods. But they didn't have geology, they didn't have plate tectonics, they didn't have a theory of mountains as dynamic, pressurized systems. A mountain, to a Roman, was terrain, something you built on, farmed on, hiked over. It wasn't a machine waiting to go off.
Here is actually a reference in one of Strabo's geographies written about 100 years before the eruption, where he describes Vesuvius and says that its rocks look like they've been burned, and speculates that the mountain used to have fire in it, but doesn't anymore. That's about as close as any educated Roman came to recognizing what it was, and even Strabo talks about it in the past tense. It used to be a fire mountain, now it's safe.
Those grapevines on the slopes were being grown in ash. Farmers knew the soil was good without knowing why. Over the centuries, the volcanic residue had weathered into the richest topsoil in Italy. People were literally feeding the city with what the last eruption had left behind. On the morning of the 24th of August of 79, and I should mention here is actually scholarly debate about the exact date. Pliny the Younger's letters say the 24th of August, but here is archaeological evidence. Fruit in the markets heating braziers in use, that suggests it might have been October. Let's go with the traditional the 24th of August, which is what Pliny wrote down.
On the morning of the 24th of August, the tremors picked up slightly. A few wells went dry, but nothing that anyone treated as a crisis.
And then at about 1 in the afternoon, 6 miles inland from Pompeii, the top of the mountain broke.
Let's talk about what that actually means. Geologists today classify what happened at Pompeii as a Plinian eruption, named after our eyewitness, Pliny the Younger, because his description of the ash column was so accurate that volcanologists still use it as the defining example. A Plinian eruption is when a volcano builds up gas pressure in a viscous magma chamber, and then the top of the chamber gives way all at once, and you get this explosive, sustained column of pulverized rock and superheated gas shooting straight up into the atmosphere.
How high?
Modern estimates for Vesuvius that day are around 20 miles, 33 kilometers. The column punched straight up through the troposphere and into the stratosphere. Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay, described it as looking like a pine tree, a long vertical trunk with a flat top that spread outward as the column hit the temperature inversion. If you've ever seen a picture of an atomic bomb's mushroom cloud, that's structurally the same phenomenon, which is why nuclear tests were sometimes compared to small Plinian eruptions.
And Pompeii was right under the downwind side of that.
Which brings us to our eyewitness. The only reason we have a minute-by-minute account of the eruption is because one extraordinary family happened to be on the other side of the bay that afternoon.
Let's meet the Plinys.
Pliny the Elder was one of the most remarkable men of the early Roman Empire. He was 55 years old in 79. He was a former cavalry officer. He'd fought in the German wars. He was the commander of the Roman fleet based at Misenum, which is across the Bay of Naples from Pompeii, about 20 miles away by water.
Misenum was the main naval base for the Western Mediterranean. Pliny the Elder was in charge of the whole Western fleet. Enormous responsibility.
But he's also, and this is what makes him one of the great figures of antiquity, a relentless, almost obsessive scholar. When he wasn't running the navy, he was reading. He read every book he could lay his hands on. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, says the elder Pliny thought any moment spent not reading was a moment wasted. He would have someone read to him during meals. He would have someone read to him while he was being driven in a carriage. He would have someone read to him while he was being scrubbed in the bath.
He wrote a 37-volume encyclopedia called Naturalis Historia, Natural History. It covered everything he could find out about the natural world. Geography, zoology, botany, mineralogy, medicine, art, metallurgy, astronomy. It's the biggest single work to survive from classical antiquity. It's still in print.
So imagine this man, 55 years old, senior Roman admiral, walking encyclopedia, lives at Misenum with his widowed sister and her 17-year-old son, who is his nephew, whom he has formally adopted as his heir. The nephew's name, coincidentally, is also Pliny, and the nephew is himself a precocious scholar. He's being groomed to follow his uncle into the Roman senatorial career track.
Mid-afternoon on the 24th of August, the elder Pliny is at home in the villa at Misenum. He's just finished lunch. He's been doing some reading in the sun. His sister hurries into the room and tells him to come outside and look at the strangest cloud.
He comes out. He looks across the bay and he sees it, the pine tree, 20 miles high, already broader than any cloud has any business being.
Now, the reaction of the elder Pliny in that moment, this is where he becomes, for all of us, the patron saint of curiosity killing the cat, because the cloud terrifies his sister, and it delights him.
He orders a fast boat prepared. He's gonna sail closer. He wants to see this thing up close. He wants data. He wants to write it up.
His nephew, age 17, is invited along. The nephew, who is writing up his homework when all this is happening, says no. He'd rather stay and finish his reading.
That is the decision that saves the younger Pliny's life, and it's why we have his letters.
Just as the elder Pliny is about to board his ship, a messenger arrives from a woman named Rectina. She's a friend of Pliny's who lives at a villa on the slope near Herculaneum, which is on the Vesuvius side of the bay, and she sends a message begging for rescue. She is trapped. The only way out is by sea. Please come.
And this pushes the expedition from a scientific observation mission to a rescue. Pliny orders his entire quadrime fleet to launch. He's going to evacuate as many people as he can off the coast.
This is also the moment he goes from being a curious admiral to being, in some real way, the first recorded person in history to knowingly sail toward a volcano.
But at the time his ships reach the Vesuvius shore, the surface of the sea is heaped with pumice. Boats are getting stuck in it. Fist-sized chunks of hot rock are raining down. His helmsman begs him to turn back, and the elder Pliny gives the line that's kept him famous for 2,000 years, quote, "Fortune favors the brave."
He pushes on. They make landfall at Stabia, which is about 4 miles south of Pompeii, at the villa of his friend Pomponianus. At this point, the eastern side of the bay is being pelted with ash and pumice, and the air is getting hard to breathe.
And it's worth pausing here to acknowledge what this mission cost. Pliny the Elder may have been drawn in by scientific curiosity, but once Rectina's message reached him, he turned his fleet into an evacuation. The ships he launched that afternoon picked up some unknown number of people from along the coast. Nobody knows how many, nobody kept count. But the sailors who rowed those boats were under his command, and most of them came back the next day, and some of the people they rescued presumably lived long lives and had grandchildren. The elder Pliny died on the beach at Stabia, but he got there because he was trying to save people. That's worth saying out loud. And here, the elder Pliny does something that is, depending on how you read it, either heroically calming or clinically detached. He eats dinner, he takes a bath, he goes to bed, and according to his nephew, his snoring was audible in the next room.
His idea was that if Pomponianus's household saw their admiral calm, they would be calm. And calm people make better decisions in a crisis than panicked people do.
But by the middle of the night, the house is shaking from ground tremors. Pumice is accumulating in the courtyard. They decide to evacuate to the beach and try to launch the ships. They tie pillows on top of their heads with cloth to shield themselves from falling rock, which, if nothing else, tells you how bad the rain of rock was getting. They walk out into the dark by torchlight.
When they get to the beach, the sea is impassable. Wind from the wrong direction. Waves too rough. The ships cannot launch.
And it's at the beach that Pliny the Elder dies. What exactly kills him is debated. His nephew says he lay down on a spread sail, complained that his chest hurt, asked for a drink of cold water, and then collapsed when he tried to stand. 2 days later, when his men could finally return, they found his body where he had fallen. No visible burns, no visible injury. He looked, his nephew wrote, like a man asleep.
Modern theory is that the pyroclastic cloud got him. He was probably asthmatic. The air at Stabia that night would have been full of superheated sulfurous gases that would take out a 55-year-old asthmatic man in minutes.
Meanwhile, across the bay at Misenum, the younger Pliny is watching the whole thing unfold. And this is the other reason we have the story, because he survived. And eventually, 25 years later, a historian named Tacitus writes to him and asks if he can describe what he saw. Pliny the Younger writes 2 letters back. They are the only first-hand eyewitness accounts of the eruption of Vesuvius that survive.
One of those letters describes his uncle's death. The other describes his own night, which was its own kind of hell.
Because by the time it was clear his uncle wasn't coming back, the eruption column had collapsed and started spreading westward. Ash was falling on Misenum. The sea had withdrawn unnaturally far from the shore, which was probably a tsunami warning nobody there could have understood. There were tremors so violent that carts on level ground rolled back and forth.
The younger Pliny writes that the darkness was not like a cloudy night or a moonless night. night. It was the darkness of a sealed room when you blow out the lamp. And through that darkness, the women were screaming, the children were crying, the men were shouting, some calling for their parents, some calling for their children, some calling on the gods, and many, he writes, calling out that there were no gods anymore and that this was the final night of the world.
He was 17 years old. He wrote all that down.
Let's go back across the bay and talk about what was actually happening in Pompeii during those same hours.
The first phase of the eruption, the one that Pliny saw, was the ash column. Pompeii, downwind, was under it, and for about 18 hours, pumice and ash rained on the city.
Pumice is basically solidified volcanic foam. It's very light. It floats on water, but when it comes down from 15 miles up, some of it is still warm, and here is so much of it that weight becomes the problem.
First, it came down about the size of hail. Then the pieces got larger. Some pieces were the size of fists. They were cracking roof tiles. They were setting fire to wooden balconies. They were piling up on flat roofs at a rate of about 6 inches per hour.
A Roman house roof isn't engineered for that kind of weight. After about 12 hours of pumice fall, the first roofs started collapsing. People who'd been sheltering in their homes were either killed by the collapses or forced out into the street to run for the harbor.
Here is an estimate from the archaeology that maybe 2/3 of Pompeii's population did get out during that first phase. They fled south toward the harbor or east away from the mountain. They dropped possessions as they ran. You find personal items scattered along the likely escape routes, jewelry, coins, keys. A woman was found with a string of pearls still in her hand.
But about 2,000 people didn't run. Some stayed to protect property. Some were too old, too sick, or too pregnant to move. Some hid in cellars or under staircases, hoping the storm would pass.
Some were already dead. The pumice fall killed a lot of people on its own before the worst came.
Then, at about 6:30 on the morning of the 25th of August, so roughly 18 hours into the eruption, the column started to collapse. The upward force that had been holding it up weakened. And that collapse is what generated the pyroclastic surges.
So let's explain that, because this is the part that killed Pompeii. And this is the part that, honestly, our casual pop culture picture of volcanoes gets wrong. You hear the word volcano, and you think of red lava flowing down a slope. Pompeii was not killed by lava. No lava reached Pompeii.
What killed Pompeii was a pyroclastic density current, a pyroclastic surge, which is a wall, a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas and fine ash and pulverized rock traveling at about 100 miles an hour down the slope of the mountain.
At its leading edge, the temperature is around 700 degrees Celsius. That's 1,300 Fahrenheit, hotter than an oven set to broil, hotter than a pizza kiln.
At 700 degrees, exposed flesh doesn't have time to burn the way it burns in a house fire. It vaporizes. The moisture in your lungs, in your bloodstream, in your tissues, flashes to steam instantly. It's believed, and the bone analysis from some of the Herculaneum victims supports this, that death is instantaneous and essentially painless. The nervous system simply cannot transmit that much signal that fast.
6 separate pyroclastic surges came down off Vesuvius that morning. The first ones hit Herculaneum, which was closer to the mountain, and on the northwest side, Herculaneum died first. Pompeii, downwind, got hit by the 4th and 5th and 6th surges around 7:30 in the morning.
Herculaneum is almost its own subject. It's a smaller town, only about 5,000 people, and it lies directly on the coast on the north side of Vesuvius. The first surge hit it probably around 1 in the morning. Many of its residents had made it down to the boathouses on the beach, waiting to be evacuated by sea. When the surge came, it arrived at such a high temperature and with such speed that it carbonized wood, vaporized flesh, and left behind skeletons and postures that suggest people died mid-breath. There are about 300 skeletons in those boathouses. Families. A pregnant woman, a young man with a sword and coins in a pouch who was probably our Roman soldier. They had all run to the water to wait for rescue. Rescue didn't come.
The Herculaneum skeletons are actually a different kind of preservation than the Pompeii casts. At Pompeii, the surge temperature was lower by the time it reached the city, and it caught people in a softer deposit of fine ash. At Herculaneum, the surge was so hot that the bodies carbonized immediately, and what remained were bones and some fragments of organic tissue, and in some cases, apparently, the skulls showed the characteristic cracks of rapid boiling of the brain. So the Herculaneum dead leave us skeletons. The Pompeii dead leave us hollow molds of flesh and clothing. Two different kinds of preservation because two slightly different physics.
And that's part of why the two cities together are such an extraordinary window. If only Pompeii had been preserved, you'd have the forms of the dead. If only Herculaneum, you'd have the skeletons. Together you get both sides of the physiological coin. Anyone still in Pompeii when those surges arrived, and we know there were about 2,000 of them, died essentially in the same instant. A woman at her loom, a guard at his post, a man still holding the bowl he was about to hand to someone, a dog still chained to the post outside its owner's house.
The surge was so fine that it infiltrated every room. It didn't knock down walls. It didn't collapse the city. It just killed everything in it and then kept going. And then when it slowed down and deposited its ash, this ash was so fine and so warm that it molded itself around the bodies and the objects. It wrapped everything in a warm gray blanket, and then the blanket hardened.
That's the mechanism. That's what would eventually give us the casts. The bodies were wrapped in soft ash, and the ash set around them like plaster. Then the bodies themselves, over centuries, decomposed inside the ash, and they left behind hollow body-shaped spaces. Negative space shells.
And after the surges, the city was buried. By the end of the 25th of August, Pompeii was under about 15 to 20 feet of ash and pumice. Only a few of the tallest building tops stuck up like the tips of shipwrecks.
And then it just sat there.
For about 1,700 years.
Pompeii was not entirely forgotten. There are Roman sources that mention it as a lost city. Occasionally, a farmer digging a well would come up with a piece of marble or a fresco fragment. In the Middle Ages, people knew there was something down there, but nobody was incentivized to dig.
The real rediscovery begins in 1748. The King of Naples, Charles of Bourbon, is having a canal dug, and the workers keep pulling up carved stone. Charles sends in a military engineer. The engineer reports, essentially, "Sire, there is an entire Roman city down here."
For about 100 years after that, the excavations were done, mostly as treasure hunting. Wealthy Europeans on the Grand Tour of Italy wanted to see frescoes and take home souvenirs. Items were chipped off walls. Whole rooms were pulled apart.
Then in 1863, a man named Giuseppe Fiorelli is put in charge of the site. Fiorelli was a serious archaeologist, one of the first real scientific archaeologists anywhere in Europe, and he changed everything about how Pompeii was excavated.
Before Fiorelli, the diggers would simply tunnel in, pull out whatever looked valuable, and leave the rest. Frescoes were sawed out of walls. Mosaics were pulled up. Statues ended up in private collections across Europe. The city itself was treated like an underground warehouse. Fiorelli, by contrast, said, "We are going to uncover Pompeii in place. We are going to dig down to the level of the Roman street, block by block, and we are going to record everything in context, where it was found, what it was near, what it was made of, who it probably belonged to."
He divided the city into regions and blocks on a grid system that is still used today. He built a museum on site. He trained the workers to treat the dig as a scientific enterprise. He essentially invented the modern discipline of archaeology, and Pompeii was the laboratory.
The most important thing Fiorelli did, and the reason his name is still remembered, is that he noticed something nobody had noticed before. Whenever the diggers came across a hollow pocket in the ash, it was usually in the shape of a person, a curled up person, a crouching person, a person with one arm raised. These hollows were bodies that had decomposed, leaving behind the shape their ash blanket had set around.
Fiorelli realized that if you drilled a small hole into the hollow carefully and poured plaster of Paris into it, you could then break open the surrounding ash and have a cast, a plaster statue of a person in the exact posture they died in. Every fold of clothing, every facial expression.
And this is the moment Pompeii goes from being an archaeological site to being something we can't really even look at without feeling something. Because the casts are not statues made to commemorate the dead. They are the exact shape the dead were in when the surge hit.
The guard of the fugitives, 13 people, a mix of adults and children found together in a walled garden where they had taken shelter. Some of the children are smaller than others. You can see their little hands.
A mother curled around two children with her body between them and the ash.
A man with a cloth pressed over his face, as though that would have helped.
Two figures in an embrace that for a long time were identified as two lovers and captioned that way on museum placards. More recent genetic analysis suggests they were actually two men, probably not related, possibly strangers who clung to each other in their last seconds, which I think, without wanting to flatten their story, is not less tender. Two strangers in the dark, in the last minute of their lives, each refusing to go alone.
A dog chained to a post outside its owner's villa on the Via Stabiana. Its collar is still visible in the cast. It had clearly been straining against the chain.
Recent work using CT scans on the casts has told us even more. One child, in the cast we call the Boy of Pompeii, can be shown by CT to have had perfect teeth. One adult had a healed broken leg. Another had arthritis in one hip. These are people we know things about now that their own doctors in the year 79 didn't know.
Here is a project currently underway at the archaeological park called the Great Pompeii Project, and part of it is recasting some of the casts that were made in the 1800s with modern techniques and using three-dimensional X-ray on them. And they're finding jewelry inside the casts. They're finding bronze coins clutched in the hands of people who grabbed their savings on the way out the door and didn't make it. They're finding keys to houses that hadn't existed for 18 centuries.
One woman is holding what appears to have been a small wooden box, which of course has long since decayed inside the plaster. The box was clearly something precious to her. We will never know what was in it. A child's milk tooth, a dead husband's ring, a handful of favorite seeds for next year's garden. Whatever it was, she ran with it.
And the ash did more than preserve the bodies, because the surge was so fine and so fast and didn't knock things over. It preserved the city.
The frescoes on the walls are still there, in living color, reds and ochres and blacks so vivid you'd think they were painted last week. Frescoes of Cupid selling perfume, frescoes of dogs chasing rabbits, frescoes of dinner parties.
In the bakery of Modestus, they found 81 loaves of carbonized bread still inside the oven. On each loaf is a stamp, because Roman bread was stamped with the baker's mark. You can read the stamp. It says, property of Sila, slave of Quintus Granius Verus.
That baker, sealer, had stamped his master's name into these loaves, put them in the oven to bake, closed the oven door, and at some point in the next several hours he fled or died, and the oven stayed closed for 17 centuries.
Graffiti still on the walls. Pompeii had an incredible amount of graffiti, election slogans, insults, love notes, accounting. Somebody wrote on a bathhouse wall, quote, I wonder, O wall, that you have not fallen in ruin since you support the tediousness of so many writers, poetry, criticism, at its finest.
T here is one scratched into the wall of a brothel that says, I screwed the barmaid. T here is one in the basilica that is a list of what somebody ate for breakfast. T here is a political poster. T here is a price list for a bar.
These are not the preserved words of emperors and generals. These are the preserved words of bakers, barmaids, teenagers, drunks, lovers, tradesmen, ordinary Romans at eye level, the only city in the ancient world where we have them.
Pompeii, because of the specific way it died, is the closest we will ever come to walking through regular Roman Tuesday. We see a city in mid-sentence, mid-meal, mid-prayer.
And we know the way they did not, what was coming next.
A few things before we close out. Pompeii today is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. About 2.5 million people a year walk through it. About a third of the city is still unexcavated, deliberately. The Italian authorities made the decision, correctly I think, that they don't have the technology yet to preserve what would come out, so they're leaving it in the ash for a generation that does.
Vesuvius itself is very much still active. It last erupted in 1944 during the Second World War. That eruption destroyed villages and knocked out American bombers in a nearby airfield. The current quiet period is the longest one between eruptions in the last 500 years. Volcanologists do not consider that reassuring. They consider it a warning.
There are about 3 million people living in the Vesuvius danger zone today. The Naples metro area, Herculaneum has been rebuilt. There are towns on the volcano slopes.
And the evacuation plans for the next eruption involve relocating those 3 million people in optimistically 72 hours. Nobody pretends that's actually achievable.
History does not exactly repeat. But mountains, when they've been patient once, have been patient before. And what they were doing was waiting.
If you got something out of this episode, hit the follow button. It's the single biggest thing you can do to help the show. And if you know somebody who loves history, send them the link. That is how this gets past the algorithm.
Next time on History Unwound, we go from a city betrayed by a mountain to a man betrayed by his closest friends. The morning of the 15th of March, in the year 44 before Christ, Caesar walks into the Senate. He never walks out. 60 conspirators, 23 wounds, the most famous murder in history.
I am George.
I am Kate.
This was History Unwound. Stay well.